The sound of the knock on the door was enough to make my blood run cold. I didn't need to open it to know what was coming. Samantha stood still in her entryway, hands clammy as she stared at the door, the echo of the knock still ringing in her ears. She had been expecting it. The HOA had been circling her property for weeks now, like vultures. But this was the first time they had made it official. She opened the door to find none other than Thomas Clark, the HOA President, standing in front of her with an air of smug self-righteousness. He was holding a clipboard, and behind him, a few of the HOA's hired contractors stood, arms folded, awaiting his signal. "Good afternoon, Samantha," Thomas said, his tone overly polite, as if he were speaking to a child. "We've reviewed your property once again, and I'm afraid there are a few violations that need immediate attention. I'll have to insist that you vacate the premises for the time being. This is a formal eviction notice." Samantha felt a rush of fury, but she controlled it. She'd been here before. This was not her first run-in with Thomas and his HOA cronies. But this was different. They had crossed a line. They were trying to evict her from the house she had spent years making a home, a house that, unbeknownst to Thomas, she had a hand in shaping the rules for. She took a slow breath, trying to keep her voice even. "You're evicting me? Are you really that confident you can do that?" Thomas gave her a thin smile, clearly enjoying the moment. "Oh, I think you'll find the paperwork is in order. You've received multiple warnings about the state of your lawn, your fences, and several other minor infractions. Frankly, I'm tired of your refusal to comply. We've given you every opportunity to follow the rules. Now, we're left with no choice." Samantha's heart pounded. But she wasn't about to let him see her sweat. Instead, she smiled, an icy smile that made Thomas take a step back. "You know," she said, her voice dropping low and cold, "you might want to read those bylaws again. I co-wrote them." Thomas's eyes flickered, his confident demeanor faltering. "What are you talking about?" Samantha stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Come on in, I'll show you the paperwork." As he hesitated, the contractors behind him shifted awkwardly. The moment stretched, Thomas clearly unsure how to respond. Finally, he stepped past her and into the living room, eyes scanning the room like a hawk. "Co-wrote?" he repeated, still dubious. "Yep," she said. "I was one of the original members of the HOA committee when it was founded. I spent months helping draft the bylaws you now enforce. So, if you're really going to evict me, maybe it's time you brushed up on them." Thomas stood still, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me you helped write the rules?" Samantha walked to her desk and pulled out the official HOA bylaws, tapping the binder in front of him. "I sure did, and according to Rule 13, Section 3, any evictions must be approved by a full HOA vote, with at least 2/3 majority. Funny enough, I don't remember you calling for any vote on my property. Did you?" Thomas's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like he might choke. You're bluffing. I know that's not true." "Oh, it's true, and I can prove it." Samantha watched, as his face flushed with growing anger, his lips pressing into a thin line. This wasn't going the way he expected, and he knew it. But Thomas Clark wasn't a man who liked to lose, especially not to someone he considered beneath him. "You'll regret this," he snapped, turning toward the door. "I'll make sure you regret it." Before Samantha could respond, he slammed the door behind him. The contractors didn't even move, still standing frozen in place, as if waiting for a command. Samantha stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. This was just the beginning. Thomas would try again, of that she was sure, but now that she'd shown her hand, he would know he couldn't just steamroll over her. Samantha sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. As she read through the local paper, her eyes skimmed over the usual neighborhood gossip, rising property values, a new business opening down the street. But then she saw something that made her pause. There, buried on the second page, was a notice about the upcoming HOA meeting. The headline was in bold letters: HOA President Thomas Clark to address violations and problematic residents at upcoming meeting. Her blood ran cold. Samantha knew exactly who he meant by problematic residents. It was her, and probably anyone else who had dared challenge the HOA's authority in the last few months. She was about to become the focal point of their latest attack, but she wasn't going down without a fight. If Thomas Clark wanted a war, he had just declared it. Samantha arrived early for the HOA meeting, her nerves on edge but her resolve steely. She knew this would be no ordinary meeting. As she walked into the room, she could feel the tension in the air. The room was packed with residents, some supportive, most silent, and others simply there to observe. But there, at the front, stood Thomas, his hands clasped in front of him, his back straight, radiating the kind of self-assuredness that had gotten him into trouble time and time again. As the meeting began, Thomas wasted no time. He launched into his usual rhetoric, speaking about the importance of maintaining order, upholding the community's values, and ensuring that problematic residents followed the rules. Samantha could feel the eyes on her, as she sat in the back, watching, waiting. She hadn't been invited to speak yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. And then, finally, Thomas turned to her. "Miss Hunter," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "It seems you've taken it upon yourself to publicly challenge the very rules you helped put in place. Tell me, how do you think that reflects on your character, or on this community?" Samantha stood up slowly, her back straight, her expression calm, but resolute. "You want to talk about rules, Thomas?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence. "Let's talk about them. You know, the ones we wrote together." She saw the flicker of confusion pass through his eyes before he quickly masked it with a sneer. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm implying that I helped write the very bylaws you're now using to bully and intimidate people," Samantha said, cutting him off. "I helped craft the rules, Thomas, and you're misusing them. So I'll ask again, how do you think that reflects on your character?" The room was silent. People were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, whispering among themselves. Thomas's face had gone pale, his confidence crumbling, as he realized that Samantha was no longer the easy target he thought she was. He stammered for a moment before his voice returned, now trembling with anger. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you can walk all over me, because you helped write these rules?" he sneered. "You're wrong. This is my neighborhood now. I run this place." "Not anymore," Samantha said, her voice firm. "Not as long as I'm here." The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. As the meeting continued, it became clear that Thomas was losing control. The other residents were starting to speak up, questioning the validity of his actions, bringing up issues they had once been too afraid to confront. But the real twist came when an elderly woman stood up. Mrs. Thompson, a longtime resident, and one of the quieter voices in the community, spoke with a surprising
free.
She said, her voice steady and clear. "I remember a time when we all worked together to create this community. It wasn't just about control, it was about cooperation." She turned to Thomas. "I think it's time for new leadership. We need someone who actually cares about this community, not just their own power." And just like that, the room began to shift. Other residents stood, one by one, and spoke out against Thomas's methods. It was a quiet revolution, but it was powerful. They had all seen through the facade. By the end of the meeting, Thomas Clark's reign had come to an end. It wasn't the loud, dramatic confrontation he had expected. Instead, it was a quiet wave of change that swept through the room. The residents had finally had enough, and they weren't afraid to speak up. Samantha watched, a quiet satisfaction settling over her, as Thomas slunk away, humiliated and defeated. His grip on the HOA had been broken, and he knew it. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. The bylaws were revisited, and changes were made to ensure that the HOA would never again be used as a tool for personal vendettas. Samantha became a respected voice in the neighborhood, not just for her role in the HOA's history, but for the strength and integrity she had shown when facing down its corrupt leadership. And as for Thomas Clark, he had been voted out of his position as president, his arrogance finally catching up with him. It was a new beginning for the neighborhood, a fresh start for everyone. But for Samantha, it was more than just victory. It was the knowledge that no matter how hard they tried, no one could take away what she had built. Not her home, not her community, and certainly not her resolve.